Well, joining me now from Geneva, we have a former judge from Eritrea's Central Court, Daniel Mekonnen. He's the executive director of the Eritrean Law Society. And from Stoke-on-Trent in the UK, we have human rights specialist and law lecturer Awol Allo. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Awol Allo, let me begin with you. For those on the outside looking in, seeing Ethiopia make this decision and extend the olive branch, saying we're willing to accept the Boundary Commission's report and implement the Algiers Peace Accord, is it as big as it seems?
I think it is a very big decision, not just for the Ethiopian state and the Ethiopian people, but also for the region. And the Horn of Africa, as you know, is a geopolitically significant region for peace and security around the world. So I think it's not just for the Ethiopian people, the Eritrean people, and people in the Horn of Africa, but also globally. This is a very important decision because precisely because of the security problem between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the Horn of Africa has been increasingly unstable. Now, this is not to suggest that this is entirely due to the conflict between the two countries, but it was increasingly aggravated by the conflict between the two countries. So the fact that Ethiopia, as a result of changes that are taking place within the Ethiopian state itself, decided to extend this gesture to Eritrea to fully and unconditionally comply with the Algiers decision and the decision of the Boundary Commission, I think that is a huge news.
Daniel Mekonnen, why do you think Ethiopia is doing this? Is it all about Abiy Ahmed and him being a dynamic new maverick leader?
First of all, I would like to start by acknowledging the importance of the latest move that has been taken by the Ethiopian government. Of course, it's coming at a very belated stage, but as they say, better late than never. So it needs to be appreciated because it's a very important, good step towards peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and as well as I also recognize its contribution in improving the general situation of peace and security in the Horn of Africa, broadly speaking. That said, I also recognize this step as part of the political transformation that's currently taking place in Ethiopia. And of course, speaking about the political transformation in Ethiopia, the first figure, very important figure that comes at the forefront of this debate is, of course, the newly appointed or the newly elected Prime Minister of Ethiopia. And definitely, it should be seen as part of what's currently taking place in Ethiopia. But I think the most important lesson that we can take from this experience is that it's a very good step for what needs to be done between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and I can take it as a very positive development in that regard.
Okay, and I'm gonna have a little swing towards Eritrea and try to ask the two of you what they might do and what they might be thinking right now. But staying with Ethiopia for the moment, Awol Allo, did they eventually realize that after all this trouble for all these years and this Cold War with the neighbor, that a town like Badme just wasn't worth the trouble?
I think Badme was simply kind of a pretext for a much broader and a deeper problem between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Let's remember that the people who have been at the helm of power in Ethiopia until very recently, even still now, it's the same party that has been ruling, but within the party we have now a different member of that coalition, the EPRDF coalition that took over in the form of Abiy Ahmed. But in the past, it was the Tigray People's Liberation Front that dominated Ethiopian politics. And the Tigray Liberation Front and the party that runs Eritrea until today are one of the most closely allied political movements, but also as people, the Tigrayans and Eritreans are very close. They speak more or less the same language, really, culturally very proximate, and the problems that led to that brutal war that killed close to 100,000 people is not really Badme. That piece of land is completely irrelevant economically, politically, but there are broader problems. And I think that close relationship, knowledge of one another, which also comes with, I think, lack of respect for one another, is the key reason, I think, that led to that broader conflict.
Yeah, and almost 100,000 killed, as you mentioned, more than 1 million people displaced. People have memories. This wasn't this wasn't too long ago. Lots of bad blood between the two sides. Daniel Mekonnen, is that one of the reasons why there's been radio silence from Yeshiwas Assefa and the Eritreans? We've heard nothing from them. Are they still licking their wounds? Are they still trying to get over all the bad blood between the two nations?
Looking into the history of the Eritrean government and how it operates in a number of ways, I would say this shouldn't really come as something surprising. But of course, normally people would expect the Eritrean government to say, officially at least, to give a response to what has been said by the Ethiopian government recently. And as I said before, this is a significant departure on the part of the Ethiopian government from what has been said and done over the last 16 years, at least counting from the time when the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission gave its verdict in April 2002. But that said, I think part of the silence of the Eritrean government can be in some ways explained, perhaps in terms of disbelief, because for many people, actually, the latest move taken by the Ethiopian government is actually coming as a big surprise. So in that sense, let's give them for the time being the benefit of doubt. Right. And perhaps I would maybe expect even more practical actions to be taken by the Ethiopian government. I am very appreciative of this latest move, but I think it would also be natural to expect, for example, Ethiopia to take another move by way of, for example, withdrawing its troops from the territories that has been given to Eritrea, one of which is actually the most important or the flashpoint of the conflict, Badme. And this may remove any other remaining excuses for the Eritrean government, and then maybe it may help in breaking the silence that we have seen on the part of the government in Eritrea over the last 10 or more days. Yeah. So I think these are some of the additional steps that need to be taken by the Ethiopian government. Right. I would say we will see what comes in the next few days or weeks. Right.
So, Awol, what are they thinking? Because they're a martial state, right? War made them a martial state. Are the Eritreans perhaps thinking that if we respond positively, we'll have to change the entire nature of our existence? Because people call them the North Korea of Africa, right? They have to be a very different country if they are at peace with Ethiopia, right?
This is a significant decision involving Eritrea. This is a decision that comes on the back of, as we said earlier, a war that killed hundreds of thousands of people from the two countries. So the silence of the Eritrean government actually says quite a lot in terms of whether the Eritrean government actually really wants to make progress on this problem or not. I think one very obvious point that a lot of experts have been pointing out is that Eritrea actually needs the security problem with Ethiopia to continue, because it's only if it has the security problem as a justification that it can continue to maintain the kind of control that it has over its population, and also maintain a large army, which is conscripting young people into the military, and one of the reasons why most people fled the country. Almost, according to some records, about 3% of Eritreans fled the country. So I think there are questions around the extent to which the Eritrean government is committed to making peace with Ethiopia. But the other argument is that, which says that Ethiopia should unilaterally withdraw from Badme. I think that misses the kind of complex relationship that exists between a country and the territory that country has been occupying for a very long time. Now, Badme has been under Ethiopia's control for a very long time, not just after the war, but before the war. And there are people who live in Badme. And there are also, I think, a large area that is covered by graves of soldiers who died there. So it would be unreasonable to expect the Ethiopian government to simply, remove whatever structures there without a determination as to what happens to the people who live there. So it's not a lot of ask, I think, on the part of the Ethiopian government to say to the Eritreans, let's discuss, and in good faith and move forward with this situation. They are saying we do accept the decision fully and unconditionally. Why is it difficult for the Eritrean government to sit down and negotiate?
Okay, so Daniel, why should Ethiopia do any more than they've already done right now, and unilaterally withdrawing wouldn't just be a piece of cake? It would be very complicated. Why don't the Eritreans at least give an answer before that?
Definitely, I agree partly with what has been said previously by Dr. Awol Allo. But what I'm trying to say here is I'm trying to make a point. You know, if Ethiopia has in principle accepted now the decision of the Boundary Commission, which has been in stalemate for the last 16 years, I'm just saying that it won't be that difficult for Ethiopia to start withdrawing its troops from the territories, at least from the flashpoint of the conflict, Badme, or alternatively, one can also say the process, for example, of inviting observers, the United Nations, the African Union, and other observers can even start. It's not necessarily a point that Ethiopia should really immediately start withdrawing its troops, but significant and symbolic measures need to be taken in order to advance the cause that has been already made public by the Ethiopian government. Relatively speaking, I can say, you know, the government in Ethiopia is much more responsive to what comes from the international community or even from its own population inside Ethiopia. For obvious reasons, we know that the government in Eritrea is completely different. It operates in completely different ways. And of course, it has always used the border conflict with Ethiopia as an excuse to suppress fundamental rights and freedoms of its population. That's not deniable. I'm not denying that. But what I'm trying to say is, of course, since Ethiopia has now taken the move, it would be very helpful to significantly push this to the next level. And it doesn't really cost Ethiopia anything in that regard, honestly speaking. Exactly. So that's the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, so Awol Allo, you're optimistic. A lot of people are optimistic. Everybody's waiting for an answer from Eritrea. Everybody's expecting, given that the Ethiopians in many ways held more power here, everybody's expecting this to sort of be resolved well because the Ethiopians have held out the olive branch. What if, however, despite all of your optimism for the two countries bilaterally and for the Horn of Africa, what if the Eritreans come back and say, go to hell, we don't want to listen to you? What happens then?
I think that is a huge possibility at this point. If the Eritrean government, this is not, by the way, the first time that the Ethiopian Prime Minister is extending this gesture. When he was confirmed as a Prime Minister, in his inaugural address, extended his hand to the Eritrean government. There was no response. This was in early April. Again, for the second time, very specifically said that it will be unconditionally and fully committed and will be complying with this decision. Nothing so far from the Eritrean government. You cannot expect any responsible government that cares about peace and security to remain silent in the face of that very open call to move forward. So it is very likely that the Ethiopian government might simply not respond. But I think if the Eritrean government does not respond, it would be very difficult for the Ethiopian government to do things alone. I think it takes two to tango. You need a partner. Any discussion around settling that dispute would require the involvement of the Eritrean government. Eritrea is a sovereign state. Without Eritrea taking an active part, no other international organization, including organizations that were parties to the Algiers argument, which is the African Union and the United Nations, could do anything. So a peace partner is important.
Well, we're all listening intently. We're waiting for whatever the Eritreans have to say, if they do have anything to say. But gentlemen, it's been great taking a deep dive and understanding this issue further. Awol Allo and Daniel Mekonnen, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.